Hi, welcome everyone. See people coming in. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. Hello, happy to have you all here. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like. See some names I recognize. Hi, Christopher. Got a few more moments for people to come in. Hey, Sheena and Gladys. Well, welcome everyone. Greetings on behalf of Episcopal Divinity School. I am Lydia Kelsey Buckland. I'm new president and dean of EDS, and it's my honor to welcome you into this space this evening. Thanks for joining us for this really important conversation about how we as Christians can remain grounded in our values of love and justice and peacemaking in this contentious and anxiety-ridden presidential election season. Tonight is actually the first in a series of 4 workshops that EDS is hosting with St. Mark's in the Bowery about leading with our values through the election season. I'm delighted that tonight we kick off this series of conversations representing 4 seminaries: EDS, Seminary of the Southwest, Virginia Theological Seminary, and Union Theological Seminary. Way to go, team, all the seminaries. Thank you, Scott and Altagracia and John, for your collaboration and willingness to guide us through this important conversation. This is a time for Christians committed to justice to join hands and to press onward together in faith, and this gathering will equip us in doing that. Before we further introduce our guests, I'd like to invite Reverend Anne Marie Witchker to offer a word of welcome on behalf of St. Mark's.
Welcome from St. Mark's Church in the Bowery. My name's Anne Marie. I'm the priest at St. Mark's. As Lydia said, we are so honored to be partnering with Episcopal Divinity School on this series and so excited for President Buckland's leadership. We know that innovative partnerships and equipping local communities to do the work of healing, bridge building, truth telling, and justice seeking are key to the renewal of the church. So we're delighted to be part of this and delighted to be here with you tonight. We hope that this conversation and the conversations ahead will give us tools to face the current moment and also help propel us into the future that we all know is possible. So thank you to our panelists and our moderator and to the whole EDS team. And again, to all of you for being here. Welcome. Many of you are already greeting each other in the chat. We'll invite you to continue doing that. Let us know where you're joining from and who you are. And we also want to be sure everyone knows that we'll have time for Q&A after the conversation. So you can put your questions in the chat during the conversation, but then, or save them for later. And I'll turn things over to the Reverend Emily Walker Cornetta to help us get started. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne Marie, and hi, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all here with us tonight. I know there are some more folks, many more folks who registered who couldn't be with us live, but who are eagerly awaiting the recording of this conversation. We are recording it to make it available to folks who couldn't be here with us tonight. Wonderful to see you all, and welcome again on behalf of EDS. My name is Emily Walker Cornetta. I'm with Episcopal Divinity School, and I'm delighted and honored to welcome our esteemed guests who will be with us and leading us in this conversation tonight. So if our guests could go ahead and come onto the screen, that would be wonderful. Thank you. So I'll start by introducing Scott Bader-Say, who is the 9th Dean and President of Seminary of the Southwest. He was appointed this year after serving on the faculty as the Helen and Everett H. Jones Professor of Christian Ethics and Moral Theology, where he served in that role for 15 years and as academic dean for 11 years. Dean Bader Say is a respected scholar of theological ethics, and his research explores issues in the areas of politics and culture, gender and sexuality, ecology, and economics. I'm also delighted to introduce Altagracia Perez Ballard, who is Associate Dean of Multicultural Ministries at Virginia Theological Seminary. She joined the faculty of VTS in 2019 and has also served as Director of Contextual Ministry and Assistant Professor of Practical Theology. Dean Perez Ballard's areas of expertise include practical theology, Latinx ministry, congregational development, education, psychology, youth development, and community organizing. And we are so grateful to the Reverend Dr. John Thetomenal for moderating and helping lead tonight's conversation. Reverend Dr. Thetomenal is Professor of Theology and World Religions at Union Theological Seminary and also a priest associate at St. Mark's Church in the Bowery. We're delighted to have all three of you here with us. Thank you. And Reverend Dr. Thetomenal, I'll turn it over to you to get us started in tonight's conversation.
Thanks, Emily, and Anne-Marie for the hard work of putting all this together. I'm eager to be in conversation and hear what our distinguished guests have to say. So I want to begin very close to the heart. I think many communities in the US are beginning to feel like things are getting out of hand. There's even a measure of despair around issues such as political polarization, the climate crisis, and global conflicts, Ukraine and Gaza being most centrally on our minds. There's also a feeling there's not much we can do about all this. So I wonder if both of you could speak to how we begin to address feelings of despair and powerlessness in ourselves and in our congregations. Altagracia, could you kick us off?
Sure, thank you. It's great to be here with all of you. It was great seeing some names pop up that I know. I guess I would start on the personal level, right? These are people's feelings, and acknowledging our feelings is really important. I think, but it was funny when you read the question this time, though I've read them several times, it was like the first thing I heard was a therapist from my past saying, feelings are not facts. And so I think there, last Sunday I was at a United Methodist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, where the Reverend Alex Awad, a Palestinian United Methodist minister and scholar, preached on daring to hope. And I think that some of it really is leaning into that. And not that despair is not going to be a feeling that we feel, but the response to despair, or the opposite of despair, is hope. And I think that when we're trying to nurture hope, because it too needs to be nurtured, some of it comes from having some perspective about the fact that though these moments feel very sharp to us, like it's very clear and very intense, that any historian will go through history and show you all the other times when societies have been in these kinds of tensions and struggles. And so the most personal response to a feeling of despair and a way to nurture hope is really gratitude. I think to name and state and claim and profess those things for which we are grateful, and we can start small and then keep moving out in terms of our circle of involvement and influence, and that will begin to remind us, like, to put things in perspective, not only for us personally, but also to then acknowledge that we do have a lot of resources that can be brought to bear on the situations that we're facing. And so the next move is movement, and get joining movement, having our movement and joining movements. So for us to get up and get involved and get engaged ourselves personally, preferably with our whole bodies and not just with our fingers. And then to join all those people on the ground that are organizing and providing resistance and a counter voice, that are engaged in ways that are responsive to the situations that are going on. It is the greatest antidote. I mean, despair paralyzes, but hope allows us, and it doesn't take a lot of hope, to allow us to have the energy to begin to engage in those things that are responding to the things that seem overwhelming.
Oh, wonderful. I took notes. Hope, gratitude, perspective, movement. Excellent. Scott?
Thanks, John, and thanks, Emily and Lydia and Anne-Marie for organizing this and inviting me to be a part of it. Yeah, thanks, Altagracia. I really love what you had to say about hope and how you started by just talking about feelings. Just, you know, these feelings are just there, and they, you know, it doesn't help to deny them, and we might not want to end in despair, but we might find ourselves feeling like that at some points. So, you know, I feel like before we move to anything else, it's how do we create a space of pastoral empathy where those feelings of despair can be kind of surrounded by a wider community, where we discover that actually we're not in this alone. And so because we recognize that the people we worship with, or the people in our family or our neighborhood or our friends, when we find other people who are struggling with these same things and discover that we can be community with one another, that we're not going through this alone, just being in community with each other gives us a place to stand, to begin to kind of examine what's going on, because we know we've got people around us. So I feel like community and hope really work in tandem with one another. It's very hard to have a lot of hope if you just feel like you're by yourself. But when we're in the midst of a community that can give us some buoyancy, can give us a little bit of hope, I think that gives us a place then to become reflective about the real situation of the world. We're in a time now, and this, you know, we could probably track back to the 1980s with the beginning of cable TV and 24-hour news cycles, all the way up through how social media has changed the ways that we take in information. But we are flooded. We're flooded with information about what's happening all around the world. And because we're flooded with information, we're constantly up against the problem of having knowledge of things that are happening, and often terrible things that are happening, but absolutely no ability to do anything about them, because they're happening in all sorts of places around the globe, and we're not necessarily in positions of power to make a particular change in those situations. So I think that being in that place where we get overloaded with information, and we are relatively powerless when we look at things that are far away from us, then we can sort of get trapped in that despairing place. Altagracia, I really appreciated you noting that, you know, one way out of this temptation to apocalyptic pessimism is to remember that there have been terrible times in the past, and that there have been plenty of times when people had an apocalyptic mindset and felt like this must be the end times and everything's coming undone. It doesn't really make it doesn't make things better now, but it helps us get some perspective, and we don't necessarily have to think that, you know, this is the worst the world has ever been, and there's no coming out of it. And at the same time, then, if we can get a little bit of perspective on it, we can start to, you know, ask questions about the things that are making us afraid or the things that are making us despair. And I think at that point we can maybe sort of muster some theological resources to help us respond. And I know for me, one of the affirmations that feels really important is the affirmation of God's providence. And providence has been kind of a tricky doctrine, because sometimes providence just sounds a lot like God's going to make everything work out fine. And we just know that that's not true, that everything doesn't always work out fine. And so if providence feels simplistic, then it becomes a conviction that we easily kind of set aside because it just doesn't seem realistic. And we recognize that the world is much more complicated than just God's going to make everything be okay. But I think there are some ways of understanding providence that allows us to trust that God's hand is still involved in history, even when things look like they're going badly, and to recognize that you know, biblically, we don't see a God who constantly stops bad things from happening, but we do see a God who constantly draws history forward in some sort of redemptive way. And being able to trust in that, to be able to know God won't necessarily stop every bad thing, but God is always ready to pull us toward a future that is good, that is redemptive, that can be redeemed. So thinking of God pulling history forward rather than pushing it, can give us a place to kind of stand and hold on to that understanding of God's providence or God's provision in a way that doesn't feel kind of naive and simplistic, but allows us to recognize that the bad things we're seeing are never the end of the story, and that God will find a way to pull these things redemptively forward. And Altagracia, to get back to what you said about joining movements, this is our way of then sort of getting our feet on the ground to participate in how God's going to pull this forward in some sort of redemptive way. And so to me, that gives us a sense of maybe kind of a theological place to stand as we're trying to keep that hope alive.
Excellent. We'll return to questions of feeling because I think they're all too often ignored in political life. I think they're at the heart of political life. But you've already begun to shift us, Scott, a bit towards the question of values. I think one way to ground ourselves in difficult times is to remember what our core Christian values are or ought to be. So, if you were asked, what core Christian values should we cherish in this season? And how do we ground ourselves in those values and advocate even for them in the public square? What would you say are those core values? Scott, could you kick us off this time?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Yeah, I guess I would start by saying that the value of love, the virtue of love, and as with providence, like there's a way in which you can say that word and it can feel simplistic or it can feel like sort of predictable. But when Jesus tells us that the greatest commandment is to love God and to love our neighbor, it gives us, I think, a path forward. It gives us something to hold on to in times when it feels like I'm not quite sure what the right step is. To come back and ask ourselves, what would it look like to love in this moment? And I think of love as really holding both agape and eros together, holding together the gift and desire. And that gift and desire are crucial to what Christian love looks like. God makes us to be people of love, both in that we can gift and in that we desire. And this mirrors something of God's own inner life in the Trinity of desiring and gifting and this sort of eternal movement of the three persons. So if we can hold on to that conviction that we are made as those who desire, and then ask ourselves, what does it look like for us to desire rightly or to desire well in this moment? I'm thinking of some of the wonderful work Willie Jennings has done talking about desire and intimacy in relation to race, and overcoming or reconciling or repairing various kinds of difference. That learning to desire those who are portrayed by others as undesirable, or learning to desire those to show that we want those who others are saying are unwanted, is a way of building the kind of beloved community that God wants us to have. And this is an expression of love as desire, but it's a desire that's really shaped by divine desire and shaped by what it looks like to pay attention to those whom God has desired and whom Jesus desired to be with and to gather in his own life. And then pairing that with love as gift, as agape, a willingness to be gifters in the midst of a culture where and a cultural moment where it feels really hard sometimes to gift because what we might be receiving back from the other side is nothing like gift. What you might be hearing are words that are harmful and hurtful and damaging. And to be able to be a people who have a capacity to keep gifting is very difficult. And again, it's hard to do alone. It's easier to do in a community. But to be a people committed to gift because we're committed to the idea that eventually as we gift, then that kind of fundamental gift exchange that God has built into a reality can get kickstarted again. And the possibility that the gift might be returned, that relationship might be restored, emerges every time we take the risk of gifting someone else, even or especially when they might not deserve it. So when Paul talks in Romans 12 about not returning evil for evil, but overcoming evil with good, It feels like this is a moment of trying to live into that, even though that might feel like the hardest thing to do at this moment. But to figure out what it looks like to be those who offer gift. And gift doesn't mean that there's never resistance, but gift is a way of recognizing that the only way to move back into relationship is if something gets offered. So I would really kind of just return us to love and return us to sort of the foundational way that that can mirror something of what we see in the life of Jesus.
Wonderful, Scott. Altagracia.
So I want to piggyback on that in terms of the sister value of love, which I think of as compassion. And it's often we think of them kind of speaking to the same thing, right? But the fact that compassion, especially I guess for those of us who speak Spanish or Italian, those of us who have one of those Latin languages in our lives, that sense of having, suffering with, having passion with, having feeling with, I think, and especially because the word, it makes the connection with the desire of alleviating that pain, being of some aid, doing something that relieves the suffering of another, that we're suffering with someone the way you do with empathy, but that you're also moved to act in a way that alleviates the pain. And I think that's important, not only for the people that we feel sympathetic towards, the people that we see that are suffering the brunt of injustices, the people that are being marginalized or minoritized in the discussion that's going on in the public square, but harder, but important to have that same kind of compassion for the people who seem so, just like voraciously in their hate and anger, because it is also coming from fear. Fear, distrust, anxiety, all the things that, since we're all human beings, all the things that, that we're feeling because of whatever reasons, how we read society, how we're living, our lived experiences, even the people that disagree with us are also coming from those same human emotions and reacting to them in the ways that they've been socialized or have learned to do. So the whole sense of that, I appreciate that we went with values and not doctrine, because the nice thing about values is that if we can name them clearly, we then suddenly find ourselves having them in common with so many other people of different faith traditions, of different cultural traditions, and that these become then places where we can both find unity for the work that needs to happen to change a painful context, but also a starting point for a conversation with people that we have a great deal of difference with. To be able to listen carefully to what a person is saying, especially when they're coming at us, and to maybe name or reflect on what we hear as the key concern and the key fear and address that, as opposed to the rhetoric that everybody gets caught up in. I think compassion is an important one for us to lean into because it's a useful response in so many different ways. I also think that the community thing, I think we value community. I think it's not just because we're mammals and biologically we value community. That's how we survive. But we've theologized about it. We have scripture that's all about God's journey with God's people, right? This journey with humanity, with creation and the forming of creation. And so that sense of community and us as a part of community is a value that we need to lean into, and not in a romantic sense, not in some idealized. So I want you to think about your least favorite vestry meeting or that committee meeting that just kept going on and on and on, even though you were all on the same topic. So if we remember that community is hard and that community is difficult and that sometimes it can be a painful place and that the sorting out and communicating that happens in community is something that we value, we say we value, but are we willing to then live with the discomfort that it means to be engaged with someone who is different, right? In Spanish, we say, cada cabeza es un mundo. Every head is its own world. And so, how do we engage each person, knowing that they're going to come at things from a very different place, listen carefully with compassion, and then truly value building community with people that are not the same as us? And then I had one, which was the first one that came to me, but I'm not sure that it's a value, so I might be cheating. We have a tradition and we have a belief in our prophetic call and in the prophet's calling to us. And so maybe our prophetic identity, maybe it really is actually repentance and renewal are the values. We believe that if we seek to make amends for the things that we've done amiss, we believe that we are in community with a compassionate God that forgives and renews our lives. And I think that for us, especially those of us who are members of the Episcopal Church, especially for us, to remember that the prophetic call is not us being prophetic out there, but that those prophetic voices are about us and our complicity in all of the ways in which the world has been damaged. And we could do a whole series on that. But I think that that sense of returning and sinning no more, right? That is a value that we hold, that we should hold personally and as a community, and that it also is a source of hope because it reminds us that just because we've fallen off the beam or we've done the wrong thing or we've lost the point or we've acted in our worst selves instead of our best selves, whether that's individually or as a local community or even as a society and a culture, that it doesn't mean that we cannot repent and return and start again. And that actually we have to do that to be in community. And so if we're trying to build a community as a nation with all the diversity that that means in the United States, then being mindful of our prophetic, of the prophets calling us to repentance and us remembering that everyone, starting with ourselves, is called to that self-reflection and that thoughtfulness about new life and making amends for things that have gone wrong.
Sounds magnificent. I have to say to both of you, this is some of the wisest offerings on the complicated emotional life of politics that I've heard in a long time. So I'm so grateful. I want to turn to something of a more framing question about how we Christians think about the public sphere. So over the course of Christian history, I'm simplifying, but there have been two options, broadly speaking. One is an attempt to control or colonize the public space. So that would be Christian nationalism. First, I mean, as a very extreme example, there may be other ways of trying to impose Christian values on the public square. And then, of course, the other classical move, particularly in certain sectarian movements, is to bail and to say, we're going to go Amish, which is a venerable Christian position. We don't think that politics is where we should be muddling. It's messy, impure, and so we're going to leave the public square and live our values within our communities. So yeah, imposition or withdrawal are two strategies. I'm thinking almost all of us are going to not be happy with either of those two options. So what is a third and responsible way of engaging in the public square and thinking about those engagements from within the deeply grounded Christian values we've already named. Altagracia, if you could kick this one off.
Yeah, sometimes I think when I hear that question or hear things the way that they often get framed, it feels a little bit like it's being framed from the victors or the winners of a certain theological perspective. I don't know, and I guess what I mean by that is that throughout history, there's always been in our tradition the role, the call and the living into a defiance of things that are sinful and broken and wrong. There's always, I think it's a more recent idea in this whole very individualistic move that we've done around Christianity, that it's about my personal relationship with God. That's really kind of new. It's not the bulk of our history as a tradition, as a religious tradition. It's always been about the community and the people and the way the people live together, which ultimately is what politics is. I always try to remind people that politics is not electoral politics. It's not partisan politics. Anybody that's ever lived in a family has managed some level of politicking. Like, how do we organize ourselves? How do we make arguments for the things that we think are best? How do we negotiate with different expectations or hopes or desires? And so I think remembering that our identity as a tradition and yeah, I mean, I know that we can immediately think of the colonial and imperialist moves. So let's not repeat that. That's not worked out well for the planet. But that history of people who have been oppressed, resisting, organizing, calling for, and modeling change, so that it really is the Great Episcopal Move. It's the Via Media, right? So we do want to have strong faith communities that seek to live authentically their faith and to therefore model a different way of living together in our differences and with our issues and things. But we also want to live into our prophetic voice of saying, it is not right. It is not right that people should be struggling for food. It is not right that people should not be able to sustain themselves. It is not right that children are dying every day from things that we have the power to stop, whether that's war, famine, disease. These are all problems that exist because of will, not because of ability. That we have, humans have the ability and the capacity to change those things. We don't have the will to do them, and that's a different thing. So I do think that leaning into that identity as a religious group is important. And I think with the diversity that happens in the square, which you intimated, I think it is about us living into our own values in the public square. And different ones of us will have different levels of comfort in terms of how and to what degree we engage. Not everyone is called, to go speak to elected officials and give them our perspective about what we think they should be doing in the face of any given problem. But I also think that remembering that in those spaces, we are called to speak for ourselves. I think one of the things that has hurt Christianity so much is that one small segment of Christianity speaks for all of Christianity. And so that, if anything, we have to witness. I can't help but feel that it's like an abdication of our call to be disciples who proclaim the gospel in the world. We were not called to live a nice life comfortably in our churches. Church is not about feeling comfortable. I know that's a shock, but it is not that is not its purpose. Its purpose is not for our comfort and for our well-being alone. It's that we might be healed and comforted and strengthened so that we can move out. It's always about moving out. So whatever the sphere, whether it's through service or engagement in political, various levels of political work, in terms of our wider society, I think it's our call. And of course, in order to do that well, we have to be grounded in a community that's seeking to be faithful about those things that we say we want for everyone else.
Wonderful. Scott.
Thanks, Altagracia. This is one of those moments when I just almost just want to clap and move on. I really like what you said about defining politics broadly. That we're always engaged in some sort of politics. If we think of it in the broadest sense of politics as a way of trying to organize a common life so that certain goods can be achieved, whether that's in a household or in a neighborhood or in a church or in a big political arena. So engaging politics in that broad sense seems to be in many ways at the heart of the gospel and at the heart of Israel's story of God calling them to be a people who model the ways of God to the world through Torah. What does it look like to walk the ways of God? It looks something like this, and it's a politics because it's a way of organizing a common life so you can achieve some goods with one another. So John, to get back to how you framed that question, right? It was the danger of a kind of Christian nationalism, a Christendom model of Christian power and control, or kind of sectarian withdrawal. And I think what you see in the way of framing the question is that both of those extremes are devastating and potentially dangerous. Well, I'll say probably a little less dangerous to withdraw. Christianity has never been at its best when we have been those who are grabbing control and power and the tools of the state and the means of violence. But I think the interesting question then is if you move in from both of those edges and ask, on the one hand over here, how do you form a community that really is a distinctive counter witness to the culture around us? And that feels like an important part of our Christian calling, an important part of our ecclesiology. And that's where a lot of kind of ecclesially focused ethics kind of moved in the late 20th century, and you get a lot of kind of focusing on an ecclesial ethics, resisting some of the more kind of direct political engagement. But then you've also got this need not to become the rulers and the power brokers, but to engage the public sphere. And I think for me, I came to the Episcopal Church after I'd done all of my graduate study. I was Presbyterian, and so I was reading a lot of Calvin and Barth, and then I became Episcopalian and started reading Rowan Williams and Sarah Coakley. But part of coming into the Episcopal Church and the Anglican tradition was discovering a really kind of generous and robust vision of engaging the public square. And that's not to say the Anglican tradition has always done that well, because we've often in our history leaned toward that Christendom model of control and power. But we've also always had this sense that it was part of our responsibility to engage the broader public and not simply live our life as a church trying to enact something of the ways of God, which is crucially important, but also that we have a responsibility to engage the common good in a broader way that might bring good to others who aren't part of our community, or might be able to work on behalf of others who don't have a voice in a way that our Christian community might have a voice. So finding the way to balance those two things feels like, that really is the third way, is to be able to do both of those and to build off of kind of the countercultural witness of the church, some sort of analogous proclamation to the wider politic or the culture. If we're not living in a way that is economically just, then our witness to the broader political world is not going to have a lot of credibility. So what are we doing with our money? How are we spending it? How are we investing it? How do we pay people? You know, right? I mean, all of the small ways that you create a budget and try to live it out at a parish level, or you have larger investments at a diocesan level and you try to figure out where are we going to put that money. All of those are decisions that allow us to model something that is distinct about economics. And then to ask ourselves, are there analogous ways we could call on the wider culture or the political powers to enact something that looks a little closer to what the way of God might look like? So that sort of feels like if we can hold both of those things together, it brings us to a place where our call for change, our organizing, our resistance can all also be grounded in the ability of local communities to hopefully already be displaying some of what it could look like to live that shared life in a different way.
Oh, fantastic. I mean, if we're not doing it, it's hard to model it. Lovely. There are so many other questions I wanted to get to, but I wonder if I can skip to the last one that I sent your way, because it's beginning to feel particularly crucial. And I think particularly since Kamala Harris has become the presumptive Democratic nominee, we have begun to see fairly explicit beginnings, and I think it's going to get worse, of genuinely white supremacist discourse in political life. Right now, the code word is calling her a DEI candidate. So this is just one example of what feels like a really racist and toxic turn in our politics. And I'm wondering, I think a lot of us could particularly use help with navigating this concrete example of a kind of public toxin that's very much part of our politics. It really always has been. It's just taking this new form. And I think both of you have thought about this for quite a long time. So maybe Altagracia, because I know these are things that weigh heavily on you.
Yeah, it's it's interesting because I guess I have probably a more moderate response than people expect. So I think, how should we respond, right? Like, okay, how should we respond? I think the answer is it depends on the context and the audience. So I think in all cases, we can simply say, in whatever context, I disagree. I disagree. When somebody says things that are clearly racist or sexist or, heterosexist, ableist, we could just say, I disagree, or I don't think that's true. And, if somebody wants to engage you in a conversation and it's not going to go anywhere, you can simply say, this is probably not the best time to go into it. I just want you to know, you one person, you crowd over talking over coffee at work where suddenly people say things and you're like, oh my gosh, these are the people I work with. Just to name the fact that I don't stand there with you. We make clear where we stand. I do think that for those places where some engagement is possible, where it is a conversation with either somebody that we have a relationship with, an ongoing relationship with, and therefore have the capacity to continue a conversation, because it's not going to be something that can be all, completely tied up in a half an hour. Being able to then decide what is the most important thing to say. Sometimes the question is like, why do you say that? I don't think that's true. Why do you say that? Because often people are just parroting what they've heard, right? They want to be part of a group, or they identify as part of a group, and that group think has them parroting words. And they just say, what seems obvious to everyone, because it's obvious to everyone in their circle. So I think challenging people with, what do you mean by that? And then they, especially if they respond with a very canned phrase, you can say, well, I'm not sure I know what you mean by that. Could you explain to me what you mean by that? I think often it helps people to hear themselves talk through their own logic that is really illogical. I mean, I don't know. I might not agree with a candidate's every policy move, but that doesn't mean that they were just hired because we wanted to look good. So we hired a Black person. I'm thinking there'd be a lot more Black people or Asian people in high places if that was the reason, if you just want to look good. So we know that that's not the reason why people are doing things. But I think being able to have a conversation and for us to be clear about why, what we think are the qualifications, and to be honest about things that we're not sure about. Like, well, I'm not sure that I agree with all her policies, but I do agree with this and this. Like, for us to be clear about what we think and what we know, so that we can actually participate in a conversation. The other thing is really to pay a lot of attention to what those statements do to us. Because I think a lot of times we want to react, and we're reacting in a defensive way, which probably means we won't have our best response as we're just reacting. And we get caught up in an argument that is not profitable. Now, I'm all about arguments that are profitable, but sometimes we get caught up in something just because we have an emotional reaction to what a person has said. I can tell, I mean, I can tell you absolutely no doubt that what is being said about Kamala Harris is nothing new to Kamala Harris. We have no need to defend her. We have no need to protect her. We have no need to argue for her. She is not where she is without people having accused her of, as someone said about me one time, oh, you're just the flavor of the month. So, people say all kinds of things, right? And these are church leaders that are saying these things. So I think us recognizing where our desire to respond is coming from, like we don't need to defend them, but sometimes the reason we're responding in a defensive way is because of how it feels for us. Either because we ourselves are female or transgendered or Black or, or Latino or whatever it is that we feel that they're saying that is also an attack on us. So, breathing deeply several times before responding, and then saying, wow, that's interesting that you say that, because people say that about all the Black people I know that are really successful. And I mean, I don't know if you want to go for snark, but I just think recognizing that it's you that's having a reaction. And I think if you're a white person from the dominant culture, you're also going to have a reaction because you don't want in any way to be confused with those people, those other white people that say those things. And I think so also recognizing, like, is it that you feel like uncomfortable, that you're feeling like, oh my God, they're representing me, or they think I'm like them, or why would they say that to me? I think being aware of what's going on with us, and then remembering that the white supremacy is what the United States is about as a dominant culture, dominant voice, dominant speech, period, dot, done. That the Episcopal Church has been the handmaiden of white supremacy in the United States, period, done, stop. So what are we arguing about exactly? Like that all this racism is a part of our society? We've known that, and I'm sure that if you signed on to this webinar, you've been working on those kinds of things. You've been working to eradicate America's original sin, right? You've been doing that work. So I think remembering that and leaning into that, while also inviting people into a real conversation that says, what do you really mean? What do you really mean when you say that? And then they hear themselves. And sometimes they'll say, oh, I guess that sounds racist. And you don't have to confirm it for them, but you can say, yeah, I was wondering, because I just don't know that sounded really bad to me too. And affirm them in their better judgment as they hear themselves, I think that's like in terms of a practical response, remembering that we can't get too defensive because this is the society we live in, and people are going to say those things, and people are saying them all the time. So trying to be responsive in a way that helps the other person be reflective of what it is they're saying.
Scott?
Thanks, Altagracia. When I teach my ethics classes, we do a lot of overview and methodology and theology, and then we also have some deep dives into a handful of issues. And there are a lot of issues on which we recognize that for most of the students who come through in the ordination track are Episcopal students. So we recognize that even though clergy might lean a little more left than the rest of the lay folks in the pews, when they get back into their parishes, they'll probably have people on both sides of a lot of the different issues that we talk about. And so we try to make sure that we're ready to hear and to find grains of truth or find something we can affirm in what the other side is saying, which is generally a great move. And then there are also moments where I want to stop and say, there are some issues on which we can't afford for the conversation to end in such a way that people feel like we can simply agree to disagree. And I think white supremacy is one of those issues. That it can't be like even really difficult issues like abortion or capital punishment, that where a lot's at stake. Even on those issues, you might say at the end of the day, we're going to have different people in this parish who have different views on a topic like this. But when you come to something, as you were talking about, John, the kind of thinly veiled racist language that pretty quickly becomes very open white supremacist language, at a certain point, we can't say, well, there's room for that perspective as well. At least within the Christian church, there's just not room for that perspective as well. And so being able to say, like, here we reach a point where it's unlike some of these other issues where we have to say that the gospel is so clear that everyone is created in the image of God and that everyone bears that image in the same way. And our baptismal covenant and our baptismal pledge to respect the dignity of every human being is so clear on this that any hint of white supremacy, at least within the church, is so clearly beyond what we could affirm as one of the alternative possible positions for Christians to hold, that this feels like one of those places where we have to say, this is simply counter to Christian faith in any way that we might describe it. And so I think there are those moments where we simply have to say, as Christians, we take a stand on this issue. And so in thinking about this with students, the question is sometimes like, what do you preach? What do you teach? When you're preaching and teaching on these hard things, do you say, this is the Christian way of thinking about it? Well, most of the time you don't. But there may be moments when we have to say, there actually is a Christian way of thinking about this, and something like white supremacy simply has no place in the church's discourse. And those are hard moments where we have to sort of draw the line. But it feels like within our political discourse now, we're not always in a place where we might have been in previous elections, where you have people with different policy positions. It feels like what we have now is, not just, maybe even not primarily policy differences, but a candidate who is, actively doing harm and damage, and who is quite upfront about plans to subvert certain ways that we've tried to build a common life with one another. So when do you reach a moment where you have to actually say something, not because you want to be partisan, but because you're hearing something that is so contrary to some fundamental Christian convictions that we have to simply say no to that? There's not room to say, let's agree to disagree. So that feels like a moment that we're all trying to tease out right now. And politically, even those of us who really believe that we want to be in a place where we can have good conversation across, political differences, seeing in a candidate someone who might be beyond the pale in certain ways that we have to really pronounce a no on certain things. And white supremacist discourse seems like one of those places to me.
Thanks so much. We have a very concrete and I think important question from Janine Otis of St. Mark's. She asks, can you be specific about strategies for holding events focused on having difficult conversations. So suppose we tried to have a difficult conversation around political life in our churches. How should we best frame those conversations? What are strategies?
And I do think I love what Scott said. I think it's so important for us to say that, like, as Christians, there are some basic things that we believe, right? And so often they're kind of like, okay, these are the givens, these are the assumptions of this conversation. And then name those things that are non-negotiable things, that all of us are created in the image of God, that God wants us to be about life, to about love and care, about compassion, about service, whatever the list is. Don't make the list too long, but write it, and even elicit it from the community to come up with, what are the things that we assume in this conversation? And then what are some of the norms that we are going to practice during this conversation? So speaking in I statements, speaking for ourselves, and not directly contradicting someone else, but speaking to the question. You know how they do, like in court, where you can't speak to anybody but the judge, right? So speaking to the question or to the issue, and not to engage in an argument with each other. And that we're going to practice listening, that we're going to listen more than we talk, right? That whole, we got 2 ears and only one mouth, that we're going to really try to hear each other in new ways. I also think it's important to have conversations, because the danger is that then certain dominant voices take over an event. So an opportunity to have some like some self-reflective questions about the issues, and then breaking up into smaller groups to have a deeper conversation is sometimes helpful, so that people who are still literally in the process of teasing out, how do I talk about these things? How do I express what my experience has taught me, or where I'm coming from, or whatever, can do it in a smaller circle where that's a little easier to do. And then teasing those out in a plenary, like to see the myriads and the differences of perspectives, but that still assume like those basic Christian tenets, I think is one strategy.
Fantastic. Scott,
Yeah,
you're
yeah, absolutely. And I would just sort of build on that, because I really like the way you described it. To begin with the conviction that people we disagree with are not crazy, ignorant, or evil. And just to start there, because just being able to name that, because sometimes we assume, well, if you disagree with me, it's because you're ignorant. You just don't know enough. So once I teach you, you'll agree with me. If they're not crazy, ignorant, or evil, or at least not most of the time, then to be able to enter the conversation and do the sorts of practices that Altagracia was describing, I think helping people have some, giving some pointers on how to listen actively and empathetically. So slowing down the conversation by asking folks to mirror back what they've heard from someone else, so that at the very least, the other party says, yes, you heard what I'm saying, right? And then at times asking ourselves, how would I depict the argument from the other side in the best possible terms? Because we're so tempted to create the straw person, to create the easy argument that we can then knock down. So we come up with the weakest argument for the other side, and then we show why it's so weak. But to challenge ourselves to come up with the strongest argument for the other side can just help us enter into a place, not necessarily that we move toward agreement, but we move toward a place where there's more understanding, and where community and communion with one another can be sustained.
And I always think it's annoyingly weird, because I am a recovering know-it-all, that when I've done that mirroring exercise that you're describing, Scott, it is so annoying, because I'll be repeating back what the person said, and then suddenly realize that I had not understood what they said when I was listening. And that now that I'm saying it myself, oh, that's what you mean. So it really is kind of a very effective way of helping us hear what the person actually said, as opposed to the filters that we have by which we process information that's coming in, and having them affirm or not affirm. Yeah, that's what I said. And then we can begin to, I like that idea of being able to name clearly the things that the parts of a person's discussion that we can see why that matters to them and why that's a value or why they hold that position, right? Because if you grew up in a community and that was the way you grew up, that doesn't excuse growing up and learning new things for all of us, but it does make things different because you realize, oh, I guess how many things have I not had to reconsider for myself that were taught to me that I no longer see as, right for me to live into.
Well, thank you both for a wonderful conversation. I think I am know-it-all who's not yet in recovery. So I think I have even more direction to go than you do, Altagracia. I think Emily wants to chime in, offer her thanks, and also to point us towards forthcoming sessions on this.
Thank you so much. And please, everyone, please join me in thanking Professor Thatamanil and Deans Perez Ballard and Bader Say for leading us in tonight's conversation. So grateful for your wisdom and for your time and for your leadership. Thank you so much. And just as we end here, wanted to let you all know that EDS and St. Mark's will be continuing this series and to look for some more information about upcoming workshops in this series called Being Church, Leading and Caring for Our Communities through the 2024 election. We'll have a workshop at the end of the month about called Praying Our Values, which will be about liturgy and liturgy planning in this season. We'll also have a workshop in September on preaching our values and how to take everything we've been talking about this evening into the pulpit, what that looks like and the questions that come up. And then in October, we'll have a conversation about leading with our values in the public square. So very much a continuation of what we've discussed here tonight. So please be on the lookout for information and registration opportunities for those upcoming workshops. And thank you again so much for joining us. Wonderful to be with you all tonight. Thank you. Bye, everyone.